You definitely wouldn't be able to achieve these crisp points with filament extrusion. Hello, if you see this video, the experiment worked, and if you don't, well, you wouldn't even know it happened. I'm going to try and resin print on fabric. I had this thought a while ago, trying to print on like a mesh or pantyhose kind of fabric using my Anycubic Photon Mono. Ever since I took a look at some of the Stratasys fabric printed samples, I'll put a few on the screen using their J850 Polyjet on fabric system. So I have this like mesh, and I think the larger gaps in this fabric will help the resin stick to it. But then I have some really old pantyhose that I think will be easier to attach to this because I can just basically stretch them around here and then like zip tie it at the top. I think that's what I'm going to do for prototype 1 of printing on fabric. My idea was originally to build like a little thin 3D printed frame to stretch the fabric and then clamp it on to this build plate. But I think for the purpose of time, it makes more sense to actually try the idea before designing something to make it easier to implement. So maybe we should try this mesh first. I'm wondering if I can cut like a small piece and then just tape it, if it will stay put, or if I should basically cut like a long piece, tie it around the top, and then tape the edges. I don't think you can tell very well, but there's a little piece of this mesh that I cut into a rectangle, slightly smaller than this build plate, which is 160mm by 95mm. For reference, then I used this white masking tape to tape the mesh onto the build plate. And obviously the tape does add a little bit of thickness to this build plate, so I'm hoping the very first layer is still able to cure properly onto the surface, but we're gonna find out. The print just finished and I have yet to look, so let's find out together if this worked. As I kind of already predicted, the mesh kind of unstuck. I should have probably cut a longer piece of mesh. Some of the print is stuck on the actual FEP screen, so I'm gonna have to clean that before our next iteration, but let me show you. A few of them actually did stick to the mesh. Keep in mind this is version 1, so it's okay if it's not perfect. Wow, they really did. They fused right to the mesh as I expected, a little bit squished. So you can see that we had most of the studs cure on the FEP sheet, which is not ideal. So I'm going to remove these before refilling the vat and trying to print again. Unfortunate, but that's why it's a test. It's looking like I'm going to need to replace this FEP sheet, the FEP sheet. Trying to remove the resin that cured on it made it stretch. This is a very old sheet. I haven't changed it since I purchased the printer, and there's a bunch of like that cured gunk that got stuck in the corner here, so it's no longer gonna lay flat. I think I have a spare one. So the unfortunate part is I could not find my replacement FEP sheet, so I tried to make use of the old one. This part of the cured resin wouldn't come off, so we're gonna try printing in one of the corners instead. I also hit the sheet with my hot air gun to kind of fix the warping that I caused from trying to scratch all this cured resin off of it. So we'll try giving it a go in this state. I think for test number 2, I'm going to try and use this ripped pantyhose because it'll be easier to secure and we won't have the issue we did with the mesh where it came off like mid-print. So I think I'm just gonna cut a piece. Alright. Oh, it ripped. Great. Let me try that again with another piece, maybe. I wonder, because this stretches so much off of the build plate, if it'll be a problem considering suction forces that occur when lifting the build plate up and down again for each layer. After trying again, this is what we're working with. Alright, let's pour some fresh resin in here. This is the Sunlu ABS Lake resin. Load this in. I did end up significantly decreasing the lift and retract speeds to hopefully minimize the suction forces that occur during lifting off of the feb sheet. So we'll see if the print turns out any better, if there's much stretching of the pantyhose while it prints. I'm hoping this works, but I guess we'll find out. Okay, so I did just quickly take a peek at this print and I think the results are really promising. So let's take a look. See how much resin got trapped within the pantyhose up here? It's okay, we'll clean it. The grand reveal. Oh wow, it definitely printed. Let's see if it attached to the fabric though. I guess I could lot some. While removing, I need to be gentle, otherwise I can rip the pantyhose because it's a lot. Whoa. Wow, it actually fused to the fabric. See how easy that is? It's already looking a lot better in comparison to first iteration. This is just a container of rubbing alcohol. I'm just trying to clean the raw resin off of it and out of the fabric. This looks really cool, especially the white contrast on this navy blue mesh. The idea for this video was heavily inspired by the J850 textile 3D printer by Stratasys and some of the samples I've seen printed on this machine. So we can take a look at these gorgeous samples, as well as this multicolor pyramid design printed on a thicker fabric. Obviously, we had to cut some corners trying to print in resin in terms of color and the type of fabric we can print on, but for the 3D models you saw me work with, I just used Onshape to create them. I made a singular pyramid by creating a square sketch and then offsetting a plane, creating a dot and lofting the square to the dot to get the pyramid, and then creating a rectangular pattern to get this stud array. And then for the other flower round design, just started with this sketch, bunch of circles using a circular pattern. Then I extruded them at different heights and used a fillet to round the tops. I really enjoy how the white resin looks on the dark blue mesh. Then to prepare for printing, I just used Chitu box, loaded in my printer, the Anycubic Photon Mono. I had to print on the edge of the plate due to some issues with my FEP sheet that we saw earlier in the video. And then after slicing, I adjusted these print settings. I increased the exposure time due to the ABS-like resin I was using, and then I ended up halving the lift speed and the retract speed, hoping that the suction forces would not be as strong when lifting and retracting the head that's been submerged. Just a heads up, the next portion of the video is the results and discussion of the print tests, so if you're not looking to stick through me talking for quite a bit about how the prints turned out and what I would have done differently, then I'd recommend you skip to this timestamp on the screen to check out the super interesting close-up shots of these resin on fabric prints. Thank you! So with the experiment out of the way, let's talk about the results and what I learned through 3D printing resin on fabric for the first time. First thing I'd like to comment is on the type of fabric. I had an easier time printing on the pantyhose or this like stretchy spandex material rather than this mesh that I purchased at the dollar store. I've seen people have such an easy time printing filament on this fabric. I think it's definitely a lot easier to secure onto a magnetic build plate that's not being submerged into resin where suction forces are a problem. If I was to use this mesh again, I would experiment with other ways to attach it to the build plate so that it doesn't come undone during the print due to those suction forces. I also think that a next step for using the pantyhose is to find a better way to attach it onto the build plate as well. Obviously tying it taut worked great because it didn't move at all during printing. However, I think it is kind of a waste of pantyhose. The pro of just being able to stretch this over the build plate and tie it rather than taping it with masking tape or using a 3D printed frame to hold it in place is that not much more thickness is being added to the build plate, so there isn't as much of a layer offset with this mesh being stretched over it compared to the layer of tape in this mesh. Another thing to keep in mind when designing for printing on the fabric in resin is that the first layer that has the higher exposure time kind of bleeds out. The best way I would describe it is it looks like elephant's foot occurred around each shape. I'm sure this can be fixed or at least improved with dialed in resin settings and more experimenting. For now, I would consider while you're designing to have a larger than a millimeter gap between each of your shapes because they do kind of bleed on the first layer that gets attached directly to the mesh. On the topic of being attached directly to the mesh, I tried pulling one of these off and it actually ripped the mesh before the resin came off. So I would say on this pantyhose, it has a really good adhesion to the actual fabric, which is extremely impressive. I think with the fabric being so thin, the resin is able to bond around the weave, and like we saw previously, it was actually really easy to remove. I've had this soaking in some rubbing alcohol for 5 to 10 minutes. Feels nice and soft, just like the fabric did before. So it was fairly easy to clean, and I'd imagine it varies depending on the fabric you use. Obviously, we'll need to consider the fact that adding thicker fabrics on our build plate not only would be harder to keep in place, but also add thickness to the build plate, so it would need to technically be rehomed. But I think for this curiosity and 2 experiments, this is not a bad result. And I could already see it being used for jewelry, pins, costumes, nice fine details of printing on fabric that you wouldn't really get with filament printers. Also, these can be painted with nice mica powders to make them look like pearls or gemstones. I'm just taking a look at the few studs that we're able to print on this mesh. I'm going to try to tear one of these off and see how difficult it is. Wow, yeah, I can't remove the resin detail without ripping the fabric. So I would say overall the bond of the resin print to these pieces of fabric is great. I definitely think the fact that this mesh has bigger holes and it's kind of stretchier and moved around more while printing than this blue pantyhose did allowed for the resin to kind of seep under the fabric and create a better bond for the print to the fabric. I definitely think this idea is still feasible considering how well it's bonding to the mesh. The biggest problem is just attaching this fabric to the print head. So you can already see what I meant by the first layer bleeding. I think what's even more interesting is the up close of how well the resin fused to the fabric. Do you see that? A little bit of the resin creeps under the mesh and cures, really creating this fantastic bond between the fabric and the rest of the print. I think with some further development, this could really be something powerful. Here's the other one of the same design, again bleeding, and then you can see right here where I tried to rip off this piece of the print and it just ripped the mesh. I find it so interesting how well it's fused to the fabric like glue. These are the studs. Again, we see the bleeding. I think what I should have done was homed the build plate with the fabric on it, and we would have had less of this bleeding problem on the first layer. Let's look at it from the side. You definitely wouldn't be able to achieve these crisp points with filament extrusion. But then again, it's still not perfect. And there's still stretch to this design, just like how the fabric is originally stretchy. See? Alright, let's take a look at this mesh, and I think I'm going to need to make the background black so that we can see a bit better. Alright, so this was our first test on this white plastic mesh. So we can still see there's that bleeding problem again. I should have probably leveled the print head after attaching the fabric, but as I mentioned earlier, the most interesting part, I think, is how much resin slipped underneath the mesh to bind the print to the fabric. You can almost barely see the mesh underneath, and for that reason it's pretty hard to rip off of the fabric. I would say it has a very good bond in comparison to some of the prints I've done of filament directly on this kind of mesh. Overall, I'm quite impressed, and I would say this is the closest that I've seen people be able to get to the Stratasys J850 textile results. Of course, I'm not going to get anywhere near the color and payoff they got, but nonetheless, this experiment was a success.